Welcome to The Debate. Today's deep dive is really a cognitive dose dedicated to curing blind spots and shattering cognitive bias.
Absolutely. And, we're taking a deep investigative look into something that's everywhere right now.
Yeah, we are looking at the unprecedented modern resurgence of ancient Stoicism, specifically the widespread commercialization of Epictetus's text, The Enchiridion. I mean, if you walk into a Silicon Valley boardroom or an elite military academy or an executive retreat, you will find people eagerly adopting this 2,000-year-old framework.
Right. They're treating it like a universal manual for psychological resilience.
Exactly. It's pitched as this ultimate hack for executive functioning. And I approach this material with the perspective that, Stoicism actually provides a profoundly necessary, empowering cognitive armor. It allows individuals to maintain agency in what is, frankly, an entirely unpredictable world.
I hear that. And I come at it from a slightly different way. While the surface-level promise of unshakable inner peace is incredibly seductive, and I get why people want that, I argue that the underlying framework is, biologically impossible. And structurally, it promotes emotional necrosis and systemic complicity.
Okay, so let's start with the foundational architecture of Epictetus's philosophy, just to be fair to the text. Because to understand its value, we have to understand its mechanics.
Sure, lay it out.
The entire system of the Enchiridion rests on this idea of the dichotomy of control, right? Epictetus draws this strict, impermeable line through human existence.
The internal versus the external.
Right. On one side of the things in our power, our opinions, our desires, our aversions, essentially our internal cognitive acts. And on the other side of the things not in our power.
Like our bodies, property, reputation.
Exactly. Our physical health, the economy, what other people think of us. The promise he makes is that if you entirely detach your well-being from those external factors and only concern yourself with your internal judgments, no external force can ever harm you.
So you achieve that state of, apatheia?
Yes, apatheia, which is total freedom from emotional disturbance.
That sounds great in theory, but let's look at the systemic reality of what maintaining that absolute binary actually requires of a human being.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, I brought the research dossier for today, and when we look at the ethical implications, this philosophy demands the extirpation of passions. It requires the active, continuous suppression of grief, vulnerability, and pity.
I mean, suppression is a strong word.
But it's accurate, right? Philosopher Martha Nussbaum, Martha Nussbaum, makes a brilliant point here. She argues that this creates an impoverished, morally hazardous anti-pity lineage.
I see why you might frame it as an anti-pity lineage, but I think that mischaracterizes the goal. Isn't Epictetus just trying to prevent us from being utterly destroyed by inevitable loss?
By just not caring about it?
Not quite. Think of it like bracing for a physical impact. If you know you're driving a car and a collision is completely unavoidable, tensing your muscles and preparing your mind is a highly logical defense mechanism. You aren't ignoring the crash, you're ensuring you survive it.
That's a really compelling analogy. But have you considered the moral cost of that specific type of psychological bracing?
The moral cost?
Yeah. Because pity and compassion require a very specific set of beliefs. To feel deep compassion for someone, you have to acknowledge that they have suffered a genuine, objective loss that they didn't deserve, and that their suffering matters.
Right.
But Stoicism explicitly rejects this. According to Epictetus, external losses like poverty, illness, subjugation, they aren't real losses because they exist outside the dichotomy of control.
I see where you're going with this.
Right.
So, if you categorize another human being's starvation or oppression as merely a failure of their own internal judgment, their failure to accept their circumstances, it completely absolves you of the moral imperative to intervene.
Okay, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because I think you're conflating internal emotional regulation with external passivity.
How so?
Well, Epictetus also argued strongly for cosmopolitanism. The idea that we are all citizens of a universal human community. A modern practitioner of Stoicism can absolutely look at someone starving, recognize that the situation is unjust, and take physical action to feed them.
But do they care deeply?
They care, They just do it without allowing the despair of the situation to crush their own inner citadel. The cognitive armor doesn't stop you from acting, it stops you from collapsing while you act.
But the mechanism he proposes to avoid that collapse fundamentally alters how we connect with others. It fosters a sort of systemic complicity.
How is it complicity?
It utilizes a highly isolated posture, disguised as enlightened self-sufficiency, to excuse passivity. And we have to look at the historical context to understand why that posture exists in the first place.
You mean Epictetus's background?
Exactly. Epictetus wasn't a corporate executive managing quarterly earnings. He was enslaved in the Roman Empire. He was subjected to extreme physical and psychological domination.
Which makes his resilience even more impressive.
Sure, but his philosophy is a dissociative survival strategy. It's a mental partition created to endure absolute powerlessness. Severing the locus of the self entirely from the battered body is a documented trauma response.
That historical context is vital, absolutely. But I would argue that extracting a survival mechanism from an extreme environment and applying it to modern life proves its durability. It doesn't invalidate it.
Proves its durability.
Yeah. We see this with prisoners of war, like Admiral James Stockdale in Vietnam, who credited his survival entirely to Epictetus. If this cognitive framework can keep a human being's mind intact through years of torture, surely it has immense practical value for navigating the lesser but still profound adversities of everyday life.
Okay, but it kept Stockdale alive in a Papio camp precisely because he had zero physical agency. Prescribing a prisoner of war trauma adaptation as the baseline operating system for daily interpersonal relationships represents a massive survivorship bias.
A survivorship bias? That's a bold claim.
It is. You're taking the psychological tourniquet of a torture survivor and telling a modern individual to wear it permanently. If you apply a tourniquet when there's no severe bleeding, you just cause the limb to wither. It amputates the capacity for deep emotional resonance.
Well, if we look closely at the underlying assumption here, this entire philosophy relies on the brain being a perfect, unassailable fortress. Does the biological data actually support that? Because even if there is a risk of emotional blunting, the alternative is being entirely at the mercy of chaotic external events.
Right.
The mechanism of Stoicism, intercepting a negative impression before it becomes a destructive emotion, is fundamentally sound cognitive processing. It gives people a structured way to pause, evaluate their automatic reactions, and choose a rational response. That is the definition of agency.
Open the dossier to the neurological data. That fortress does not exist.
Neurologically speaking.
Right. The core tenet of the dichotomy of control, that we can consciously intercept and control our ascent to incoming impressions, is biologically compromised from the start. We have to look at the timing of conscious volition, specifically Libet's landmark experiments and subsequent fMRI data.
Oh, you're referring to the studies measuring the readiness potential in the motor cortex?
Yes. Libet's experiments demonstrated that the neural activity associated with decision-making, that readiness potential, builds up in the brain up to 300 to 500 milliseconds before the subject reports any conscious awareness of making a decision.
Half a second.
Half a second. In neurological terms, that is an eternity. Your body is already moving, your endocrine system is already initiating a response before your conscious mind even receives the memo. So the Stoic demand that we sit in our rational citadel and perfectly govern our reactions relies on an illusion.
So you're saying the perception of absolute cognitive control is just a narrative crafted by the mind post factum.
Exactly.
That is an interesting interpretation of Libet's, LIBS, though I would frame the conclusions differently. The readiness potential shows that our brain initiates actions before conscious awareness, yes. But those same neurological studies also identify what neuroscientists call free won't.
Free won't?
Right. We possess a conscious veto power. Even if the initial emotional or physical spike happens pre-consciously, we have the neurological window to halt or redirect that impulse before it fully manifests. And that veto power is exactly what Stoicism trains.
Like cognitive behavioral therapy?
Exactly. It is the core of modern CBT. You reframe the negative event, change your belief about it, and alter your emotional trajectory.
Okay, but see, cognitive reappraisal is highly adaptive, and CBT is a brilliant clinical tool.
But modern proponents constantly misclassify Stoicism as just an ancient form of CBT. They are fundamentally different.
How so? They both rely on reframing judgments.
CBT asks you to examine and process an emotion to understand its origin. The Enchiridion frequently demands expressive suppression. Because Stoicism pathologizes strong negative emotions as inherently flawed judgments, adherents are predisposed to suppress them entirely, and clinical psychology demonstrates that this kind of emotional suppression leads to severe, long-term cardiovascular, immunological, and psychiatric degradation.
I would argue that neuroplasticity cuts both ways here. If you consistently practice the cognitive reappraisal that Epictetus advocates, reframing external events as indifference, you are actively strengthening the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the amygdala, amygdla.
Regulating or overpowering?
It is essentially resistance training for the brain. You aren't suppressing the emotion. You are preventing it from forming in the first place by changing your underlying judgments about the world.
But what happens when the hardware itself is damaged? Let's factor in trauma and chronic stress. Environmental trauma physically alters the architecture of the amygdala, and reduces prefrontal cortex activity. It induces learned helplessness, which biologically cripples the exact rational self-governance that Epictetus demands.
So you're saying it's biologically incompatible for some people?
Yes. When Epictetus says, choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed, he is effectively applying a software solution to a profound hardware alteration.
If the biological motherboard is melted, yes, the software will struggle to run. But the vast majority of people turning to Stoicism today are not operating with a melted motherboard. They are dealing with intense, chronic modern stress. And for them, the software is incredibly effective.
Effective in the short term, perhaps, but destructive in the long term. Just look at the empirical scoping reviews in oncology.
Oncology?
Yeah, cancer patients. When patients internalize these stoic traits, rigid self-reliance, refusal to display vulnerability, focusing entirely on emotional endurance, they suffer significantly adverse health outcomes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This pseudo-stoicism causes patients to delay critical help-seeking behaviors. They underreport severe physical symptoms because they view asking for help as a failure of their internal will. They isolate themselves at the exact moment when external reliance is biologically and medically required for survival.
That highlights a danger in rigid fundamentalist application, certainly. No philosophy should be used as a reason to ignore medical reality. But if the biology is flawed and the empathy is eradicated, what happens when this framework is deployed at a cultural level?
That cultural deployment is exactly what worries me the most.
Because a major reason this text is resonating globally is its cultural utility. In an era where individuals feel utterly overwhelmed by macroeconomic forces or political instability, focusing strictly on what is within your locus of control provides a necessary navigational framework. It prevents societal paralysis.
It prevents paralysis, maybe, but it results in profound logical and sociological failures. Let's look at the formal logic first. The Enchiridion commands us to live according to nature, assuming the natural order of events is inherently good or rational. This commits the fatal naturalistic fallacy.
Meaning?
Specifically, David Hume's Hoymas is-ought problem.
Right, Hume's Hoymas is-ought problem being the philosophical concept that just because something is a certain way in nature doesn't logically mean it ought to be that way morally.
Correct. Nature contains disease, infant mortality, and catastrophic natural disasters. Stoicism conflates what naturally occurs with moral goodness. So if we follow Epictetus strictly, building a hurricane shelter or treating a bacterial infection with antibiotics is technically a violation of Stoic principle, because you are refusing to accept the natural course of events as they were destined to happen.
Well, I have to challenge that entirely. Modern readers are not refusing to build hurricane shelters, nor did the ancient Stoics. They built aqueducts and hospitals.
But logically, it conflicts.
The reason this supposed logical flaw doesn't manifest in practice is because we extract the practical, cognitive utility from the ancient theology. Epictetus believed in a providential, teleological universe, a cosmos directed by a divine reason. He mentions God or the divine constantly. We don't need to adopt his theology to utilize his cognitive tools.
I disagree.
We can accept the hurricane happened, recognize we cannot control the weather, and focus our energy on rebuilding rather than despairing.
But extracting that theology leaves a dangerous void. If you're a secular executive trying to run the software program without the providential operating system it was explicitly coded for, the framework fractures.
Fractures how?
Without a benevolent God guaranteeing that everything happens for a good, rational reason, the dichotomy of control instantly degrades into fatalistic nihilism. You are simply instructing people to masochistically submit to random, chaotic suffering. And notice who adopts this secular version most readily. Weird populations.
Weird populations? Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Exactly.
It certainly has high adoption in those demographics, but I don't see why that invalidates the framework. People in high-stress, high-responsibility roles naturally seek out tools for emotional regulation.
Because for that demographic, Epictetus's assertion that wealth, physical safety, and social standing are just irrelevant indifference is a luxury belief.
A luxury belief?
Yes. It is a cognitive posture that can only be comfortably maintained by people whose baseline survival and institutional protections are already secured by the dominant structures of society. It's incredibly easy to say wealth is indifferent when you already have it.
I fundamentally disagree that it is merely a luxury belief. In fact, applying this framework in marginalized communities can be incredibly empowering.
Empowering?
Yes. If you hand this text to someone facing systemic prejudice, you are handing them the ultimate tool of defiance. You are telling them that their inherent worth, their moral character, and their mind are sovereign territory that no oppressor can ever touch.
But does it fix the prejudice?
Look at Nelson Mandela. He relied heavily on Stoic principles while imprisoned. It doesn't induce passivity, it preserves the psychological integrity required to fight another day.
That is a very selective reading of how this plays out culturally. When deployed at scale, it acts as acute cultural blindness. If you instruct marginalized groups that systemic oppression, poverty, and prejudice are mere indifference outside of their control, you are actively weaponizing psychological resilience against them.
How is preserving someone's psychological agency weaponizing resilience? I don't see the connection.
Because it frames structural injustice as a personal mental failure. Think about it. If a person is suffering under systemic discrimination, the Stoic framework implies that the bias of others shouldn't disturb their inner peace. And if they are disturbed by it, it's their own fault for having the incorrect opinion about an external event.
Wow, that's a dark interpretation.
It is the ultimate tool for organizational and societal gaslighting. It shifts the entire burden of oppression onto the psychological fortitude of the oppressed. And in doing so, it completely absolves the dominant culture of any ethical requirement to enact systemic reform. You don't have to change the unjust system, you just mandate resilience training so the disenfranchised learn to endure their subjugation gracefully.
Okay, I see your point regarding how institutions might misuse the philosophy to avoid accountability. An HR department using Stoicism to ignore a toxic workplace is clearly an abuse of the text. But, we cannot blame the philosophy for the corruption of the institution using it.
But the philosophy enables it.
The core tenet remains, you cannot control the unjust system, but you maintain absolute control over how you let it affect your mind. Abandoning that agency doesn't fix the system. It just guarantees individual suffering.
But that focus on absolute individual agency ignores the reality that human beings are deeply interconnected, biologically and socially. True human flourishing might actually require the very vulnerability, the interpersonal friction, and the collective action that Stoicism actively tries to extinguish. We have to stop viewing these ancient texts as universally applicable panaceas.
Well, as we synthesize the findings of this deep dive, it is clear that the Enchiridion presents us with a profound tension. We live in an incredibly unpredictable world where chaos is, frankly, the rule, not the exception. Epictetus offers a necessary psychological shield, teaching us that while we cannot control our circumstances, we always retain sovereign control over our response.
Right.
And that resilience has allowed individuals to survive the unsurvivable and maintain their dignity in the face of absolute powerlessness.
Yet we must weigh the cost of that shield. The biological data reveals that demanding total emotional suppression runs counter to our neurology and degrades our physical health. And structurally, categorizing the concrete conditions of human life as mere indifference strips away our moral imperative to help one another. It weaponizes resilience to maintain an unjust status quo. It asks us to amputate our deepest human connections in exchange for the illusion of total safety.
It really leaves us with a sobering final thought. Psychological armor, by its very nature, is designed to protect the heart. But a barrier that is entirely impermeable stops anything from getting in, and it stops anything from getting out.
Exactly.
We are left to decide if the emotional safety that Stoicism provides is worth the potential isolation it requires. Use this analytical approach whenever you encounter universal solutions, question your certainties, and continue building your mental immunity.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on Cognitive Dose. We will see you next time.